The Lady in the Empty Portrait, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with an empty portrait frame hanging in an old manor. The painting has vanished, but Miss Marple suspects it took a dangerous secret with it. Before we uncover the mystery of the Lady in the Empty Portrait, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales.
Chapter 1. The Empty Portrait. Ashcombe Manor stood on a gentle rise above the village, where the morning mist lingered long after the church bell had finished ringing. The old house had watched generations come and go without ever changing its expression. Ivy clung stubbornly to the stone walls. Tall windows reflected nothing but grey skies and ancient oak trees. The villagers often claimed the manor remembered every secret ever whispered inside its walls. Most dismissed such talk as harmless gossip, yet when Lady Eleanor Ashcombe was found dead at the foot of the grand staircase one damp October morning, even the boldest voices became strangely quiet. The house no longer seemed merely old, it seemed to be listening. Inspector Graves arrived before sunrise and quickly announced what appeared to be the obvious conclusion. Lady Eleanor had slipped while walking downstairs during the night. The polished oak steps could be treacherous, especially in poor light. The doctor found nothing to suggest otherwise. The servants spoke softly of the dreadful accident, and Lady Eleanor's nephew, Richard Ashcombe, accepted the explanation with surprising ease. There was sadness in the house, certainly, but beneath it rested something harder to name. Relief, perhaps. It hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Miss Marple reached the manor shortly after luncheon, carrying her small knitting bag and wearing the same gentle expression that often caused people to mistake kindness for innocence. She greeted the inspector warmly, listened without interrupting, and thanked him for explaining the circumstances. He seemed pleased to have everything neatly arranged already. "A sad business," he said, "but accidents do happen." Miss Marple smiled politely, though her eyes wandered beyond him. They rested not on the staircase where Lady Eleanor had fallen, but on the faces of those standing nearby. Grief looked different on each of them. One appeared anxious, another looked impatient. One young maid seemed almost frightened whenever Richard glanced in her direction. The drawing-room offered warmth from a crackling fire, yet the room itself felt strangely uncomfortable. Portraits of the Ashcombe family covered the walls from floor to ceiling. Stern gentlemen in black coats stared across the room with cold confidence. Ladies dressed in silk gazed into the distance with quiet pride. Children smiled faintly beside hunting dogs and polished ponies. Miss Marple admired each painting without speaking, moving slowly along the wall until something interrupted the careful pattern. Between two magnificent portraits hung an empty gilt frame. No painting remained inside it, only faded backing cloth, stretched across the wooden support, collected dust beneath the afternoon light. She stopped before it for several moments. "How curious," she murmured, almost to herself. "One would expect such a handsome frame to hold something rather important." The butler answered at once, almost before anyone else had noticed the question. "That frame has been empty for years, Miss Marple. Lady Eleanor simply never removed it." "So it has always looked like this?" "Indeed, madam." Miss Marple nodded pleasantly, though the reply settled rather poorly in her thoughts. The frame itself carried almost no dust along its upper edge. The brass hanging hook gleamed faintly where countless fingers had clearly touched it not very long ago. The wall behind it showed a pale outline where a larger canvas had once rested before being moved. Years had not done that. Days, perhaps, weeks at the very most. Inspector Graves joined her with an easy laugh. "I fear the portraits won't solve this one." "No," replied Miss Marple quietly, "but people often tell the truth without meaning to. Houses can be rather similar." Before the inspector could ask what she meant, a sharp crash echoed somewhere above them. Every conversation stopped. A door had slammed with enough force to shake dust from the ceiling beams. Richard Ashcombe excused himself almost immediately, claiming an open window had caught the wind, though outside the air was perfectly still. Miss Marple watched him disappear up the staircase without a word. Her knitting remained untouched in her hands. She looked once more at the empty frame. Whatever portrait had once belonged there had not vanished by chance. Someone had taken it away. Someone inside Ashcombe Manor believed that an empty frame was far less dangerous than the picture it had held. Miss Marple had only just arrived. Already the house had offered its first secret. Chapter 2. The Face That Disappeared. Morning arrived beneath a blanket of low cloud, and Ashcombe Manor felt colder than it had the day before. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows, while the servants moved through the corridors with unusual care, speaking in little more than whispers. Every room seemed occupied, yet the house had fallen into an uneasy silence. People who had lived together for years suddenly behaved like strangers. They watched one another. They measured every word. Even the breakfast table, once known for cheerful conversation, became little more than the sound of teaspoons against china. Miss Marple spent the morning chatting with the staff, never asking her questions too directly. People often revealed far more when they believed they were simply making conversation. The elderly cook recalled seeing Lady Eleanor carrying a wrapped canvas through the west corridor only 3 evenings before her death. She had assumed it was being sent away for cleaning. The gardener, however, insisted he had seen Richard Ashcombe leaving the portrait gallery late that same night, looking over his shoulder more than once before disappearing into the library. The young housemaid offered yet another account. She nervously claimed the empty frame had always been empty, though her trembling hands suggested she no longer believed her own words. Inspector Graves had reached a different conclusion altogether. He spent most of the morning questioning the family solicitor, convinced that an argument over Lady Eleanor's will explained everything. The solicitor remained calm, answered every question without hesitation, and even seemed willing to help. It all sounded neat, too neat. Miss Marple had met enough respectable gentlemen to know that honesty rarely arrived wrapped so perfectly. She wandered back into the portrait gallery while the inspector continued his interviews. The empty frame still held her attention, but today she looked beyond it. Tiny marks in the wallpaper caught her eye. They formed a faint rectangle beside the frame, slightly darker than the surrounding wall. Something much larger had once hung there. It had been removed carefully, and the remaining portraits shifted just enough to hide the empty space. Whoever arranged them understood that most people noticed faces before they noticed walls. It was a clever trick, clever enough for almost everyone. That afternoon, Miss Marple wandered into the Manor's dusty library, where shelves of forgotten family journals lined the walls. One thin ledger lay open upon a writing desk, as though someone had left it in a hurry. Inside was an inventory of the Ashcombe collection, written many years earlier. Each portrait had been listed by name. Miss Marple read the pages slowly until one entry made her pause. Lady Eleanor with her sister Margaret, oil on canvas, displayed in the East Gallery. She turned back towards the portrait room in her thoughts. There had been no painting of 2 sisters anywhere in the house. Margaret. No one had mentioned her. Not once. As evening settled over the estate, Miss Marple quietly climbed the narrow staircase leading into the attic. Dust covered every step except for a single path where recent footsteps had disturbed the grey powder. She followed them without hesitation until they ended outside a small storage room. The door stood slightly open. Inside, leaning against an old wardrobe beneath a faded sheet, rested a large canvas. Miss Marple gently pulled the cloth aside. There was Lady Eleanor, painted exactly as the ledger described. Beside her stood a younger woman, with the same eyes, the same smile, and the same unmistakable family resemblance. Two sisters, one forgotten by everyone inside the manor. Then Miss Marple noticed the smallest detail of all. On Margaret's left hand, someone had carefully painted over a wedding ring. The brushwork was skillful, but not perfect. Under the fading paint, the circle of gold could still be seen. Miss Marple gave the faintest smile. "So," she whispered, "someone has been trying to change the past." At that very moment, a floorboard creaked somewhere behind her. She wasn't alone in the attic anymore.
Chapter 3. The Lady Inside the Portrait. Miss Marple did not turn at once. She remained studying the portrait as though she had heard nothing at all. The footsteps behind her stopped only a few feet away. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then came the quiet sound of the attic door being pushed fully open. "I rather hoped no one would come up here," said a calm voice. Miss Marple turned slowly. Standing in the doorway was the family solicitor, Mr. Harding. His coat was neatly buttoned despite the dust around him, and his face carried the tired smile of a man who already knew his excuses would no longer matter. "I imagine you did," Miss Marple replied gently. "Those secrets have an unfortunate habit of refusing to stay hidden." Before another word could be spoken, hurried footsteps climbed the attic stairs. Inspector Graves appeared, breathing rather harder than he would have liked to admit. Two constables followed close behind. He looked first at the portrait, then at Mr. Harding, and finally towards Miss Marple. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "I suspected you would. You simply arrived a few minutes later than the truth." Mr. Harding lowered his eyes. The confidence he had carried throughout the investigation had quietly slipped away. There seemed little purpose in pretending any longer. Miss Marple stepped beside the painting and rested one hand lightly upon its frame. Lady Eleanor discovered that this portrait had been altered. Margaret Ashcombe had married in secret many years ago. Someone painted over her wedding ring so that marriage would be forgotten. If Margaret had married before her father's death, the inheritance passed along a very different path. The family fortune, the manor itself, and everything attached to it belonged to another branch of the family. Lady Eleanor intended to restore the painting and reveal the truth. Inspector Graves looked towards Mr. Harding. "You handled all the family papers." "Yes," Mr. Harding answered quietly. "And you knew exactly what this painting proved." Again there was only silence. Miss Marple continued in the same calm voice. "Mr. Harding believed the truth would destroy everything he had spent years protecting. He removed the portrait and hid it here. On the night Lady Eleanor confronted him, they argued on the landing above the staircase. She refused to remain silent. He lost his temper for only a moment. One push was enough. Afterwards, it looked very much like a tragic fall." Mr. Harding closed his eyes. "I never meant—" His voice faded before the sentence could finish. "One moment of anger, that was all it took." The constable stepped forward, and without resistance he offered his hands.
As they escorted him downstairs, Ashcombe Manor seemed strangely lighter, as though the old house itself had grown tired of carrying the burden. Later that morning, the missing portrait was returned to its rightful place. Once again the two sisters looked out across the drawing-room, their faces untouched, their story finally complete. Visitors would admire the painting for years without ever guessing how close it had come to disappearing forever. Yet Miss Marple knew that pictures, much like people, rarely lie forever. They only wait for someone patient enough to notice what has been carefully covered. She collected her knitting bag and paused beside the front door before stepping into the cool autumn sunshine. A faint smile crossed her face. If you've enjoyed solving this mystery with me, I'd be delighted if you'd subscribe to the channel and join me for another visit to a quiet village where appearances can be wonderfully misleading. There are plenty more mysteries waiting, and I do hope you'll be here for the next one. As Miss Marple walked down the stone path, she glanced back only once. High above the entrance hall, the restored portrait caught the morning light. For just an instant, the sisters almost seemed alive. Or perhaps Ashcombe Manor still had one last secret it wasn't ready to share.